Why did the Nephilim terrify ancient civilizations? For centuries, the name Nephilim has drifted through the corridors of ancient texts and sacred scrolls, like an echo from a forgotten world, a whisper wrapped in shadow, too immense to ignore. They rise from the mists of history as figures of impossible stature, described as giants, not merely in form, but in power, carrying within them forces beyond human comprehension. Feared as destroyers, revered as demigods, worshipped as divine, and hunted as abominations. They existed at the intersection of terror and reverence. Why did they inspire such trembling in the hearts of entire civilizations? Why did their very name ignite both awe and dread? To seek the answer is to step into the marrow of humanity's oldest fears, to cross into that haunted borderland where myth bleeds into memory and where history itself bends beneath the weight of the unknown. Here, the veil between the natural and the supernatural thins, and the past speaks not in whispers, but in the thunder of truths long buried. What follows will not simply inform you, it may unsettle you, for it strikes at the very question of what it means to be human. If this journey stirs your imagination, subscribe and join the discussion below. Your thoughts, your questions, and your voice are part of the story we are about to unfold. The giant shadows that walked among men. The chronicles of antiquity, from the Book of Enoch to the weathered Sumerian clay tablets, to the faded brittle fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, do not whisper of the Nephilim. They thunder their presence into the corridors of human memory. These were no ordinary men, no products of the soil alone. They were beings who dwarfed our kind both in body and in aura, their very existence pressing upon the ancient world like the weight of a storm-heavy sky. In Hebrew, their name, Nephilim, carries with it a shadow, a fall, the sense of something once higher that has descended into our realm. Scripture sketches them as colossal warriors, figures of renown whose reputations outlived their flesh. In the traditions of Sumer, they surface again, refracted through a different lens, as the Apkallu, sages of unfathomable wisdom and monumental size, sent by the gods themselves to mold the fragile clay of early civilizations. And yet, across every record, whether etched by a reed stylus into wet clay or brushed by a trembling hand onto sacred parchment, there is a tone that cannot be ignored, a tone of caution, reverence, and a quiet, tightening thread of fear. This fear is not the panic of the moment, but the slow, enduring dread of knowing one lives in the shadow of something that cannot be equaled. Imagine yourself, if you can, in that out age. The land is raw and untamed, the horizon vast and unbroken. One day, as the light bends toward evening, you see a figure crest the hill, a man, yes, but a man who towers like the trunk of an ancient cedar, whose stride devours the earth, whose silhouette swallows the sunset behind him. His voice, when it comes, is not the voice of a neighbor or a fellow tribesman. It is the deep, low thunder of a storm rolling across distant mountains, a sound that travels through the air and settles into your bones. Ancient accounts describe them in fragments, but the fragments are enough to conjure their enormity. Arms like the trunks of oaks, eyes that burn like embers, the strength to shatter stone with a single blow. Even stripped of weapons, they were themselves living fortresses, embodiments of unassailable force. If the legends carry truth, and the persistence of their echoes suggests they do, then kingdoms were not merely defended or conquered by men, but rose or fell at the will of these giants. A single Nephilim might tip the scales of power as casually as one tips a clay vessel, spilling the lifeblood of nations without pause or pity. But here lies the deeper truth, the one that hums beneath the surface of all these ancient stories. The fear they inspired was never solely born of their size, nor even of their unmatched strength. Size and strength alone are things that humanity can learn to navigate, to confront, even to overcome. The truest fear, the one that burrowed deepest into the hearts of shepherds and kings alike, was the fear of the other, the one who does not play by the laws of your world, the one who stands both within and beyond the human story. To the humble shepherd, guiding his flock beneath a violet dusk, the Nephilim would have seemed less like men and more like the gods themselves come down from their celestial thrones. But these were not gods who arrived to bless, nor angels descending with tidings of peace. No, these were presences that ruled by the weight of their being, that imposed their will not by asking, but by existing. They dominated simply by being what they were, and to those who stood before them, that domination was as inevitable as the coming of winter. In their towering forms, humanity beheld a mirror, but it was a mirror that reflected our fragility, not our strength. We saw ourselves reduced to scale, to the smallness of ants beneath the boots of something vast. It is one thing to know you are mortal. It is another to stand before a being who makes you feel the brevity of your breath, the softness of your bones, the swiftness of your end. The civilizations that lived alongside these giants learned more than the boundaries of their power. They learned the shape of their own limits, and limits once seen cannot be unseen. The presence of the Nephilim was, in a sense, an existential wound to the human spirit. For we like to believe, then as now, that the world is ours, that our strength and our will are the ultimate measure of this earth. But to share it with something greater, something untethered from our frailties, is to be reminded that sovereignty is an illusion, that control is always provisional. Every city wall, every blade of bronze, every song sung to the gods was, in their shadow, stripped bare of its power. And so the stories of the Nephilim are not merely stories of the extraordinary, they are, in their essence, stories of perspective, the shift that happens when one understands one's own scale in the grand machinery of creation. They are parables of humility written in the bodies of giants. For the ancients, to live in the age of the Nephilim was to live in a tension that modern man can barely imagine. It was to wake each day under the same sun, but in a different kind of world, one in which the hierarchy of beings was visible not as a theological concept, but as a physical reality. One glance upward into the face of a Nephilim, and you would know that the ladder of creation extended far beyond your reach. This is perhaps why their memory is etched into so many traditions, why their presence lingers in myth, religion, and whispered legend. They were not simply opponents in battle or anomalies of nature. They were living reminders of the divide between what man is and what man wishes to be, and such reminders cannot easily be forgotten, even when those who bore them are long gone. In the end, the Nephilim stand at the intersection of fascination and terror, where human curiosity meets the primal urge to survive. They compel us to look back at a past that may not be entirely ours, to confront the possibility that our history was once shared with beings who made us feel as small as we truly are. In their shadows, we see both the grandeur and the frailty of humanity laid bare, and we are left to wonder whether the fear they inspired was ever truly about them, or whether it was, and always has been, about what they made us see in ourselves. Forbidden knowledge, secrets humanity was never meant to know. Power in all its forms is a dangerous inheritance, but there is a kind of power that transcends the grasp of muscle and weapon, a power born of knowing. Knowledge, when it emerges from sources beyond the human sphere, carries with it a weight that is more than intellectual. It carries the power to dismantle worlds. And in the annals of ancient memory, there are stories, not whispered as rumor, but written with the gravity of truth, that speak of such knowledge. The Book of Enoch tells of the Watchers, heavenly beings who descended from their appointed places in the celestial order, crossing the boundary between the eternal and the mortal. These Watchers imparted to humanity arts that were not meant for human hands, truths that did not belong to the earth. If the Nephilim were truly their children, then they were heirs not only to towering strength and imposing form, but to a dangerous and alien wisdom, a birthright both luminous and lethal. It is said they taught metallurgy, giving mankind the ability to forge weapons far beyond the crude stone tools of their ancestors. Bronze and iron would cut deeper, pierce further, and spill more blood than the sharpest flint could ever hope to. In the hands of ordinary men, these weapons could alter the balance of tribes. In the hands of the Nephilim, they could alter the balance of the world. They revealed the craft of architecture, not in the humble scale of village huts, but in the moving and shaping of stones so massive that they mock the capacities of even our modern cranes. They whispered the movements of the stars and the secret mathematics of the heavens, mapping the vault of the night sky with a precision that still startles those who study the monuments aligned to solstice and equinox. Perhaps they even spoke in the language of the divine, syllables that resonated not only in the ear, but in the soul, unlocking powers now lost to us. For the kings of those early days, men whose thrones were often built as much upon fear as upon reverence, the appearance of such beings among their subjects would have been a nightmare made flesh. What sovereign, clinging to the fragile scaffolding of his authority, could endure the presence of a giant who spoke the truth of the heavens, who could command both awe and loyalty without a crown? And what priest, whose power rested upon the mysteries of his temple, could watch his people's devotion drift toward these strangers without feeling the stones of his sanctuary shift beneath him? The Nephilim's knowledge was not merely information, it was influence. And influence is the first crack in the walls of power. And so we must ask ourselves, what is it that remains upon the earth as testament to their wisdom? Across continents, across oceans, stand the great megalithic enigmas. The pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica, the cyclopean walls of Sacsayhuaman, the colossal statues of Easter Island, the inexplicable stone spheres of Costa Rica. These works defy the conventional narrative of gradual human advancement. They sit in silence, heavy with a question. Could these be the enduring fingerprints of the Nephilim? Could these be the works of beings whose intellect matched their vast physical presence, whose understanding of the world's forces was so advanced that their creations still puzzle the modern mind? To the ancient worldview, knowledge was never a neutral possession. Every revelation carried a moral charge. It was either a gift from the mouths or a curse from the same source. Knowledge could heal or destroy, bless or blight, and often the line between blessing and blight was drawn only in hindsight. For the Nephilim, their knowledge was as double-edged as the weapons they forged. To some, it must have been a beacon, a promise that humanity could rise beyond its limitations, touch the stars, and command the forces of nature itself. To others, it was a blade pressed against the throat of order, a threat that could unmake kingdoms and dissolve the fragile compacts of power that held civilizations together. History teaches that those who hold power seldom welcome disruption. When something or someone arrives with the capacity to destabilize the hierarchy, the reaction is rarely patience. It is swift, decisive, and often violent. In the presence of the Nephilim, the thrones of kings trembled, the altars of priests wavered, and the fear of losing control ignited the will to destroy. That destruction might take many forms: campaigns of war, orchestrated betrayals, or even the rewriting of history itself to bury the memory of those who had once walked among men. But here lies the heart of the philosophical question. Was it the Nephilim's knowledge itself that was dangerous? Or was the danger always in the human heart? We like to imagine that some truths are inherently corrupting, but perhaps it is not the truth that corrupts. Perhaps it is our inability to wield it without turning it into a weapon. In this light, the Nephilim's inheritance was not simply forbidden because of cosmic law. It was forbidden because humanity was not yet capable of bearing it without self-destruction. The line between a divine gift and a divine curse is not in the gift itself, but in the one who receives it. In the shadow of these ancient giants, humanity learned both awe and envy. We saw in them what we could be, strong beyond measure, wise beyond precedent, and what we feared to become, corrupted by our own ascent. Their presence was a mirror that revealed both our potential and our peril, and perhaps that is the truest reason why their knowledge was feared. It did not simply threaten the structures of human power. It threatened the entire story humanity told about itself. To admit the Nephilim's wisdom was to admit that the human race had not been the sole author of its civilization, that the great works of history were not entirely ours. For many, that was a truth too dangerous to bear. So the knowledge became legend, the legends became myth, and the myths were softened, blurred, or erased. Yet even in erasure, their shadow remains. It lingers in the unanswered questions of archaeology, in the uncanny alignments of ancient monuments, in the recurring motifs of gods who walk among men and teach them the arts of civilization. It lingers in the deep, archetypal unease that stirs when we confront the possibility that the past we know is not the past that was. In the end, the Nephilim's knowledge was dangerous not because it came from beyond, but because it showed us how small the distance is between the human and the divine, and how swiftly that distance can be crossed, for better or worse. Perhaps it was never the Watcher's descent or the Nephilim's birth that broke the cosmic order. Perhaps it was humanity's first intoxicating taste of the infinite, the moment we realized we could reach higher than we were ever meant to, and that we might never want to come down. Bloodlines of the gods and the curse they carried. Perhaps the most unsettling truth whispered about the Nephilim is not the towering height of their forms, nor the sharp brilliance of their minds, but the nature of their birth, a scandal written in the stars and the soil alike. Many traditions, spread across continents and millennia, speak of them as the offspring of heavenly beings and mortal women. This was not a romance in the human sense. It was a trespass, a crossing of thresholds marked sacred since the beginning of creation. In the ancient worldview, the realms of the divine and the human were separated by an inviolate line. That line was not merely a boundary, it was a safeguard, an unspoken covenant holding chaos at bay. To breach it was to invite imbalance into the world, to open the door through which corruption might spill like floodwaters. And yet, the Nephilim stand in history as living evidence that this breach occurred. If they were indeed the hybrid children of gods and mortals, they carried in their veins a bloodline both wondrous and deeply perilous. Wondrous because such a mingling promised the raw strength and luminous vitality of heaven itself. Perilous because such union threatened to dilute and distort the very order of the divine. Within them, the purity of the immortal mingled with the hungers and imperfections of the mortal. It was this fusion, unpredictable, volatile, and beyond the capacity of mortals to control, that sent a shiver through the civilizations who knew of them. The ancients did not imagine the divine as aloof abstractions. Their gods were beings of will and desire. If those gods could be swayed, tempted, or even defied to the point of mingling their essence with humanity, then the unshakable hierarchy of heaven itself could no longer be trusted. The existence of the Nephilim whispered a dangerous question into the collective mind. If the gods could break their own boundaries, then what law was truly unbreakable? We find the echo of this dread across the mythologies of the world. In the Greek tradition, tales of demigods like Hercules, Perseus, and Achilles tell of unmatched feats, slaying monsters, toppling kings, bending fate, but always shadowed by tragedy, by madness, by divine retribution. These heroes bore the unmistakable mark of divine heritage, yet it never guaranteed peace. Rather, it guaranteed turmoil. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh recounts a ruler two-thirds divine who, despite all his victories, cannot escape the truth of mortality. His quest for eternal life ends not in triumph, but in the bitter revelation that even divine blood cannot unmake death's decree. Such stories served as cautionary mirrors to the reality the ancients believed they faced in the Nephilim. The message was relentless. To carry the blood of gods is to be bound to great deeds, but also to great downfall. It is to be a bridge between heaven and earth, and to live on that bridge is to feel it tremble beneath your feet. To the ancient mind, the Nephilim were not merely giants, a term too small for the immensity of their presence. They were a rupture in the moral and spiritual fabric of reality, a living contradiction to the order upon which the world had been founded. They embodied a paradox, beings of divine origin, yet bound to human flaws, elevated beyond mortals, yet fated to suffer mortal ends. Their very existence was a theological challenge, a dangerous proof that the divine realm was not immune to weakness or desire. Consider the implications for the religious systems of the time. Temples were not only places of worship, but the axis points of cosmic order, overseen by priests whose authority depended upon the separation between mortal and divine. The Nephilim blurred that separation until it vanished. If divine beings could walk the earth not as gods, but as hybrid warriors, then the distance between altar and battlefield collapsed. The holy could bleed, the sacred could beget the profane. Such revelations could shake the foundations of belief, not only in the Bloodlines, but in the structures of power that claim to speak for them. And yet, for all their danger, the Nephilim must also have been objects of fascination. In their bodies, humans glimpsed what it might mean to transcend human limitation. They were proof that the flesh could house more than flesh, that veins could carry something of the infinite. This is perhaps the cruelest part of their curse, that they were envied even as they were feared, desired even as they were condemned. The ancients understood what we too often forget, that the blending of realms is never without cost. In every mythology, such unions lead to imbalance, and imbalance always demands correction. The gods of Olympus, the councils of Mesopotamian deities, the divine hosts of the Hebrew scriptures, all eventually turn their faces against such offspring. In the end, the Nephilim bore the weight not only of their own actions, but of the transgression that brought them into being. They were walking judgments, marked from birth by the sin of their creation. In the philosophical sense, their story is a meditation on boundaries in the chaos that follows when those boundaries are ignored. It asks whether greatness can ever be separated from corruption, whether power can ever be given without also giving the seed of destruction. The Nephilim's tale is not just about the collision of heaven and earth. It is about the fragility of the order that keeps the universe from unraveling. Perhaps this is why, in so many traditions, their end is inevitable. Whether by divine decree, catastrophic flood, or the slow erosion of time, the bloodline of the Nephilim is destined to dwindle, to be buried under the weight of history. Their memory survives not as a genealogy, but as a warning. Even the mightiest blood, when born of broken laws, carries in it the poison of its own undoing. And yet, there is a part of us, the same part that kept their legends alive, that refuses to let them go. We see in their story a reflection of our own restless longing to bridge the gap between what we are and what we wish to be. The Nephilim may have been cursed, but in their curse we recognize a dangerous dream. The dream that humanity might one day rise beyond itself, even if it means breaking the order of the world to do so. It is this tension between the terror of their existence and the allure of what they represented that keeps their shadow long across the centuries. To speak of the Nephilim is to speak of the place where aspiration meets hubris, where desire meets danger, and where the divine, in reaching toward the human, leaves a mark that cannot be erased. The Great Erasure, how history tried to bury the Nephilim. The most haunting question is not how the Nephilim lived, but why they vanished, and why the silence around their name feels so deliberate. Across continents and cultures, ancient traditions carry the same refrain: an age-ending calamity, a world purged. The stories come to us in many languages and symbols: great floods that swallowed the mountains, wars that ground empires into dust, purges in which the giants were hunted like beasts until none remained. In the Hebrew scriptures, the biblical flood narrative stands as a watershed moment, a divine act of cleansing meant to scour the earth of a race corrupted beyond redemption. Strikingly, the same undertone threads its way through the Mesopotamian epics, through Mesoamerican codices, through the oral histories of Pacific Island peoples. It is as if humanity, scattered yet connected by some shared ancestral memory, could not forget that the world once turned against the giants in unison. If these accounts are more than allegory, if they are the fractured testimonies of a real past, then the disappearance of the Nephilim was not the slow erosion of time, but an act of intentional obliteration. The ancient world may have conspired in its entirety, kingdoms, priesthoods, and perhaps even divine forces themselves, to wipe them from the earth. But to erase a race so monumental, whose presence could not be mistaken or ignored, would require far more than swords or storms. It would require erasing them from memory itself. And herein lies the more chilling truth. The scarcity of physical evidence is not the absence of proof, but perhaps the proof of absence enforced with precision. The burning of libraries, the deliberate redaction of sacred texts, the recasting of origin myths, each act a calculated stroke in the slow, methodical burial of their reality. In one age, the Nephilim might have been heroes or tyrants, worshipped or feared. In the next, they would be reduced to half-forgotten fables. And in ours, they would be labeled as pure myth, an artifact of superstition, a curiosity for scholars but nothing more. Yet the erasure has never been complete. Fragments have survived, stubborn as the stones they once moved. They surface in the margins of holy books, in lines so strange that translators hedge their chanting. They echo in the whispers of tribal elders, telling stories to children under the stars. They hide in the shadows of ancient monuments whose builders are listed as unknown, structures that defy the limits of the civilizations to which they are attributed. These remnants, scattered and incomplete, are like fossils protruding from a cliff face, tantalizing hints of a larger whole, enough to unsettle the mind and invite the question, what else has been buried? The answer to why the truth might still be feared even today may be far more unsettling than the erasure itself. To acknowledge the Nephilim would be to admit that human history is not entirely human. It would be to confess that the earth has been shared, and perhaps shaped, by a presence we did not create, did not control, and may not have survived by our own strength. Such an admission would not merely demand the rewriting of textbooks, it would collapse the scaffolding upon which much of our cultural identity rests. In the corridors of academia, where the guardians of established history defend their narratives with ferocity, the introduction of the Nephilim as historical fact would be seen not as an expansion of truth, but as an existential threat. In the vaulted chambers of religious institutions, the admission would spark theological crises, forcing a re-examination of doctrines and divine order. And in the political sphere, the acknowledgement that humanity was once subordinate or even prey to another race could ripple outward in ways impossible to contain. So it is easier, safer, to keep the giants as phantoms, to relegate them to the twilight between myth and fact, to consign them to the status of symbolic archetypes, figments of ancient imagination, and thus strip them of any true danger to our present order. But in doing so, we may blind ourselves to something greater and more dangerous. Because to seek them, to sift through the forbidden corners of history where their shadows still fall, is to court a kind of knowledge that resists the safety of certainty. It is to risk finding that the Nephilim never truly left, that they do not belong to the past as neatly as we imagine, that their presence, like a dormant seed, may simply be waiting for the conditions to rise again. And perhaps this is why their erasure feels so deliberate, because what has been erased can also be restored. All it would take is one discovery, one undeniable piece of evidence, to snap the threads of denial. One skeleton unearthed whose size mocks human proportion, one inscription translated too faithfully, one structure dated too far back to fit the accepted story. When that happens, if it happens, the walls between myth and reality will crumble, and the giants will step back into our history not as fable, but as fact. Until then, the Nephilim linger at the edge of our collective consciousness, not as living beings, but as presences, patient and implacable. They remain in that liminal space where curiosity meets dread, where the human heart feels both the pull to know and the instinct to turn away. They are the dark reflection of our own ambition, a reminder that the past is stranger, darker, and more vast than we dare to imagine. And maybe in the end, the greatest erasure is not the one committed by kings or priests, or even by the hands of gods. Maybe the greatest erasure is the one we commit ourselves, the choice to look away from the truths that would undo us. For if the giants who once walked among us have not truly gone, then our history is not closed. And if their shadows fall again across the earth, we will face the same choice our ancestors did, to confront them or to bury them once more.